Great. Well, thanks everyone for having me. Real privilege to be with you tonight. I love these events, reboot events in particular, specifically because of what Alonzo said. No question off limits. Questions were such a big part of my own journey to faith. I hope that'll be the case for you as well. So my title for tonight, Would Jesus Social Distance? What I really like about this question is that it invites Jesus into our very present circumstances. You might think, how could Jesus possibly relate to something we are dealing with in the 21st century, 2,000 years later? Didn't Jesus live too long ago in too different of a culture to be relevant to us today? My experience is that every time I think this, Jesus proves me wrong. Time and time again, I find myself surprised at the extent to which Jesus can relate to even the fine details of what we're going through right now. So, would Jesus social distance? Now, some people think if Jesus were living today, this would have been the Last Supper. All right, it would have been over Zoom, and for some reason they didn't have enough room for all of the apostles. Maybe that was an older version of Zoom. And they even cite evidence for this view, right? Because the Bible itself says that after Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to Mary and she recognized him, the first thing that Jesus says to her is, "Do not touch me." So there you have it. Jesus was a social distancer. And if that doesn't convince you, there's even a t-shirt that I found and a hashtag, and there's really no arguing with that. So case closed. Jesus was a social distancer. Time for questions. But I know Zoe's not going to let me get away with things that quickly, so I've got a few more thoughts to share. Would Jesus social distance? Now, I have no intention tonight of giving you a medical answer about the extent to which you should be socially distancing. That's not my expertise. I have no intention of giving you a political answer. That seems to be no one's expertise at the moment. But as a philosopher and a Christian, I do think we can draw out of our current experience of social distancing some deep questions about the meaning of life. The topic is not an abstract one for me. I want you to know that. It's been very personal. My dad is a type 1 diabetic. And when the pandemic hit, he was about to have major surgery. Now, my brother is a nurse and my sister-in-law as well. And they told me straight up, they said, "Dad probably can't survive the coronavirus." And so we have largely stayed away. Sometimes you need to be away from those you love for their good. At the very time I wanted to be with my dad most, he was about to have surgery, I needed to distance myself from him. And that was precisely because of my love for him. If you're watching this and God seems distant to you, I wonder if something similar could be the case. Could there be the case that this distance that there seems to be is not because God doesn't love you or care for you, but precisely because he does? That's a question. I just want to park that for now, but I want to return to that question a bit later. But first, let's look at a few ways that Jesus did not social distance. When Jesus walked the earth, leprosy was a dreaded disease. There was no cure for it. And once people realized a person had leprosy, they were basically banished from society. They underwent mandatory social distancing. They could no longer sit and eat with their own family members. They couldn't hug their children. They could only speak to them from a distance. Now, usually we would say that's hard to imagine, but now that seems strangely familiar. In public places, if people were approaching, those with leprosy would have to shout out the warning, "Unclean, unclean, I'm unclean." And it's in that context that a man with leprosy came and knelt before Jesus. And he said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Now, Jesus could have just healed the man from a safe distance, but as the Gospel of Matthew records it, Jesus reached out his hand and he touched the man. He said, "I am willing, be clean." And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Now, this doesn't mean that all of us should be touching those who are sick, but Jesus was a healthcare professional, right? Jesus was a healer. And so it was appropriate for Jesus to do so. And it was so like Jesus to reach out for those who everyone else had pushed aside. Another time in a religious leader's home, in the middle of an upscale dinner party, a woman who was known as a sinner in the city, that's what she's called, she heard that Jesus would be there. And so she showed up and began to weep in Jesus's presence. And her tears actually fell down onto his feet. And then she got down on the ground. She wiped his feet with her hair and she kissed his feet and she poured perfume on them. Can you imagine the scene? She had broken all norms of social distancing and Jesus allowed it. He allowed it for all to see. He was teaching the world a new way of loving, not love as a trophy, but love as a gift, not love that you earn, but love that's simply to be returned. People kept saying, Jesus, what are you doing? Why are you wasting your time with these lost causes? But the more reason Jesus had to stay away from someone, the greater his longing to draw near. As he said, remember, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick who need a doctor. All of this was part of an even more fundamental breach of social distance, the incarnation. God coming to live a human life in the person of Jesus. Compared to a perfectly holy God, every one of us, in a moral sense and in a spiritual sense, would look like a leper. And yet Jesus not only reached out and touched us, he became one of us. Metaphorically, think about this. He voluntarily became a leper and chose to live among lepers so that lepers would not be alone and unloved. Can you think of anyone in the world who would do that? No, because there's only one person in the universe who loves that extravagantly, and that's why I personally choose to follow him. And yet, there are also some ways in which Jesus did social distance. If we think of the incarnation again, from the opposite direction, yes, the incarnation bridges the social distance between us and God, but it also creates social distance between Jesus and his heavenly Father. To come and heal us, Jesus had to distance himself from his own Father. Now, when COVID-19 became a pandemic, my brother Jay and his wife had just had a baby. But my brother's an emergency room nurse, and so he had a really difficult decision to make. He worked per diem, which means he wasn't required to go back to work. He wasn't going to lose his job or anything like that if he didn't go back. He was also in a financially stable position, so he didn't have to go back to work for that reason. And he knew that if he went back to work and therefore was so heavily exposed to the virus in the hospital, then he wouldn't be able to spend time with my dad, given my dad's diabetes and his approaching surgery. And even worse, it meant that my dad wasn't going to be able to spend time with his new grandson. So significant stakes there. Now, my brother, Jay, he decided to go back to work. He chose to socially distance himself from family in order to go back to the hospital to save the lives of complete strangers, people he had never met. Why? Why would you do that? Where does the intuition come from that each life is sacred, that each life is worth sacrificing for, that each life is equally valuable? When the pandemic was growing in North America, I saw a photo of someone holding up a sign, and the sign read, "Sacrifice the weak." We recoil at the statement, but again, why? If the fundamental guiding principle of reality is survival of the fittest, if that's at the center of everything, then what's wrong with sacrificing the weak? Isn't that just the flip side of the same coin? But what if the fundamental principle of reality is a God who, despite being the fittest and the strongest of all, sacrificed himself for the weakest? What if that's true? Then, when my brother went back to work, he wasn't just being foolish. No, he was aligning himself with the truth about reality. And he was loving like the God who is the ground of all truth and who created each person in his image and therefore endows each and every person with infinite and inviolable worth. Here's a second reason Jesus sometimes social distanced himself from society and from others. To get time alone in prayer with his Father. And this is important for the specific purpose of setting the trajectory for the rest of life. Jesus often withdrew for times of prayer, and one time he withdrew to the desert for 40 days. And while he was in this time of isolation, without his normal community or routines or resources, we're told that the devil tempted him 3 times. The devil tempted him in 3 ways: to live for comfort, for power, or for money. But each time, Jesus said no. He said, no, life is about more than that. I'm not going to settle for those things when I know deep in my heart that God has so much more for me. And each time Jesus was tempted, he actually responded specifically by quoting from the Bible. I was 19. I wasn't a Christian up until this point. I was 19 when someone challenged me not to criticize the Bible before I had actually read it. And I took that challenge. And what I found is that every other book you can simply read, but the Bible reads you. As you read the Bible, you don't just learn about what's on its pages, you learn about yourself, who you are, why it matters, what you were made for. Ravi Zacharias was 17, the founder of this ministry. My dear friend, he was 17 when a Bible was brought to him on a bed of suicide. He had swallowed poison because he didn't believe that life had any meaning or any purpose. And a Bible was brought to him in his hospital bed, and his mother read him the words of Jesus from the Gospel of John. Because I live, you also will live. And right there, lying on that hospital bed, Robbie said, God, if that is you speaking to me, then I will leave no stone unturned in my pursuit of truth. What about you? Have you set the trajectory for the rest of life? Money, power, comfort, pleasure, or the eternal purpose and meaning that are found in the pages of the Bible? Now is the time to make that choice. Let's look at one more instance of Jesus social distancing. We'll go back now to Jesus telling Mary not to touch him. This is Mary Magdalene, Jesus' friend. She's gone to the tomb on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion. She's crying. There's someone there. She thinks it's the gardener. All of a sudden, he says, Mary. He calls her by name. And immediately, she knows it's Jesus. She turns towards him and cries out, Teacher. And then Jesus says this odd line. He says, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. We joked about it earlier, but it's fair to ask, what's going on here? Mary thought Jesus was dead, and now he's alive. And she's completely overjoyed, and she just wants to hold him. And Jesus is the one who's always welcoming everyone, the lepers, the tax collectors, the outcasts. He's letting everyone approach him and cry on him and wipe his feet with their hair. So why would Jesus, of all people, say, don't hold on to me, and I need to go? Remember, I needed to be away from my dad, my father, during this pandemic for his own good, because of my love and care for him. Why might it be good for us for Jesus to go? Many people assume if God really cared whether or not we believe in him, he'd make himself more obvious. Okay, Bertrand Russell was one of these people, one of the 20th century's most intellectually accomplished atheists. He was once asked, what would you say if it turns out you're wrong and you die and you wind up standing face to face with God? What will you say? And Russell famously responded, he said, "Not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence." But I would argue, you can't just say not enough evidence. You need to ask, not enough evidence for what? What is God after? You can't judge God's methods until you identify his aims. If God just wants intellectual belief in him, then sure, he could just appear in the sky in a terrifying blaze of glory. Yes, he could do that. Or he could write the New Testament really small on every single atom in the universe, and we would find it under a microscope. That would be pretty cool. But here's the thing. We would basically, in those instances, we would basically be forced to believe. Mere intellectual belief is not what God's after. It's not his aim. How do we know that? Because the Bible says that even the demons have intellectual belief, and they shudder. It does them no good. But what if instead what God desires with us is relationship, is trust, is intimacy? Those things cannot be forced. They have to be pursued and developed over time. And they have to be based on loving someone's character. They can't be based on just fearing their power. I think the Christian philosopher Blaise Pascal puts this best. He put it best in the 17th century. And listen very carefully to his words. Let me read them to you. Willing to appear openly to those who seek him with all their heart, and to be hidden from those who flee from him with all their heart. God regulates the knowledge of himself such that he has given signs of himself, which are visible to those who seek him and not to those who do not seek him. There is enough light for those who only desire to see, and enough obscurity for those who have a contrary disposition. When Ravi heard those words on a bed of suicide, those words from the Bible, "Because I live, you also will live," they pierced his heart. Precisely what he needed to hear in that precise moment. There was an encounter with God. But then there also needed to be a pursuit, right? He responded, "I promise to leave no stone unturned in my pursuit of truth." There was a desire to see all that God wanted to show, and that set the trajectory for his entire life. In one of the last conversations I had with Ravi, as he was dying of cancer, he said, "You know, I only gave myself 17 years, and then I tried to take my life. But God gave me 57 more, and on into eternity. I have nothing but gratitude." Do you know that contentment? Contentment in life, contentment through all of life's twists and turns, even contentment in death. Are you willing to leave no stone unturned in your pursuit of God so that you can see all that he desires to show you? Social distancing has revealed to us in physical terms the spiritual reality of our relationships. The reality is that we keep people at arm's length, and that was the case long before COVID-19. And I'm not just speaking metaphorically here. We literally keep people at arm's length. When we walk onto a bus or into a movie theater or up to a gate at the airport and we survey where everyone else is sitting, what do? We instinctively walk to the seat which is the most isolated from all of the remaining seats. Imagine if you walked onto a bus and saw there were just a few people there, but instead of choosing your own row, you actually decided to sit down next to another human being. Imagine if you voluntarily decided to draw near to someone rather than socially distance yourself from them. People would think you were so weird. What does that say about us? For a while, we blamed technology. It's the phone in our hand. It's the earbuds in our ears. They've ripped us out of authentic community and into our own little virtual worlds. But social distancing has shown us it's more complicated than that. Technology is not clearly the problem, because now we're using the same exact technology that we so often blamed for disconnecting us, and now we are using it to deeply connect and to be in real community in some beautiful ways. We're doing it tonight. The problem is not technology. The problem is how we use it. And that's determined by what's in our hearts. That's an internal problem. How many feet do you put between yourself and other people? 6? 10, 20. I'm not talking about physical feet here, but more fundamentally, relationally. How close is close enough? How much of your real self are you willing to show? Are you truly known by anyone? You see, the problem with not being known is that you can't be loved, because you can only love what you know. And do we do the same with God? Choose to socially distance yourself from him. Happy to have a brief, superficial conversation across an aisle, but actually sitting next to each other, so close that your arms might brush against each other, that's weird. That's too close. That's too vulnerable. That's exposing too much of ourselves. That's giving up too much control. That's asking us to trust him too deeply. Christianity is an invitation to be fully known and fully loved. That's very scary. I get that. But it's also absolutely worth it. One of the most heart-wrenching articles I've read on the coronavirus was a USA Today article. It was entitled, "We Hear You, Dad." A woman named Abby, her dad was dying in the hospital from COVID-19, and she couldn't go to see him. He couldn't speak anymore, but he could hear. And so the nurses carefully positioned a phone so that Abby and her siblings could speak to him. And they spent the next 36 hours on the phone listening to their father die, just praying that he could hear their voices. And Abby remembers saying into the phone, she remembers saying, "I love you, thank you, I'm sorry." She remembers saying, "Breathe, Dad. We need to hear you breathe." And sometimes many seconds would pass in between breaths. And then when a breath would come, Abby would say, "We hear you, Dad. We hear you." And reading this brought me to the end of Jesus' life, where it says, "With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last." It's Mark 15. God the Father heard Jesus' last breath from distance. His son was dying, and he couldn't be there the way he longed to be. Over hours, as Jesus hung dying, his father listened to every breath, and he heard the breaths getting more and more difficult until he heard that deafening silence when another breath never came. The Christian message is that he did that for us. He was willing to go through that social distance in order to bridge the distance between us and him. That's how much he loves us. That's how much he desires to be in relationship with us. And because he really does understand, even though he lived a life 2,000 years ago, because he really does understand what we're going through right now in the most visceral way, because he lived it. That's why he is the one we can turn to at this time with our fears, with our grief, and certainly with our questions.